Hello, my friend. I hope you're having a good start to your day. And I'm so happy that we get to talk together on this special week where we're going to, in the US, have some 4th of July celebrations, but across the world, we're having a reminder of lots of other things out in England. And that's exactly where I am today, as I have pre recorded this episode, but knowing it would come out on the day or right around the day that I'll be exploring one of my favorite authors' actual area. Tolkien in the Oxford area in England, but also I'll be exploring Jane Austen, another favorite author this week. My daughter gave me a Mother's Day gift of a train tour at her area where we take a train from London to the area where Jane Austen lived. And I am just swooning, guys. And then today we also get to talk to Phil Nation again. We got to talk to him about this beautiful Bible study, the open Bible he shared with us, as well as today come to find out he's such a Tolkien enthusiast as well and has recommendations for us, which I've already started to read post interview about the Proverbs of Middle Earth. And we are just enjoying a great sit down today with him. Hopefully, you are having some 11sies with us, allowing for some true Hobbit snacks as we pursue Middle Earth. But let's remember together the reason why we pursue the great books, as my dad used to always make me read, and now I read them on purpose, is because a lot of the reading that is just written for pleasure is not so deep and is not so full of wisdom as this. Sometimes people are just selling like Joe March did in Little Women just for spectacle, or you hear me talk about my mystery dinner games versus the deeper products and places that I've written from the heart. And I think there's just a different thread when you know somebody has put something deep of their soul into the work. And that's what you get when you read Tolkien or Jane Austen. And I just love to introduce you guys or reintroduce you or sit with you if you already are a lover of great books as we talk about why these authors, these books are important, and particularly today, what is so great about Middle Earth and what lessons we can get as individuals, as couples, and most of all, just as we are on this spiritual journey of our own, as we really hope to be strong, to be empowered, to do what is good and holy and virtuous. And so that's what this conversation is all about. So know that you can step into Lord of the Rings with us today. I hope it gives you this chance to learn a little more about why this book and the series The Lord of the Rings sells almost next to the Bible in terms of just how many, not nearly as many as the Bible, but so many, and just one of the best sellers of all time because it is just so rich. And now we get to explore it together today on the pod. So like I said, get your tea, get your scones, whatever English treats you want as we roam the English countryside and Tolkien's world for a little while today together. All right, let's talk to Phil Nation now. Phil, we are so happy to have you back on the Enneagram and Marriage Pod. Thank you so much for joining us for the special Tolkien conversation this summer.
Well, you are so welcome. I had such a good time and was glad that came up in some of our chats, and so happy to delve into this world that is a great it's a great place to enjoy, but it's a great place to gain wisdom.
Oh, yes. And that is often hard to find, right? We're looking at all these things, scanning for negativity, and to find somebody whose work actually both allows us to feel like we can grow in wisdom and is pleasurable, isn't that a joy?
It really is. I read a lot of books and probably more nonfiction than I do novels. And so it is so fascinating to come across a set of novels, and certainly Tolkien's work stands head and shoulders above most other people's works, but there's such a depth and pulls back the veil of our humanity to really reach the inner parts of who we are. So it's enjoyable to dig down into who he was and how he wrote all of these great legends.
Mm, absolutely. And I know he was a man of faith, and we'll get to meet him in heaven one day, which will be a joy. But really, his works are, we're excited to meet Jesus, but we know Tolkien will be there too.
That's right.
But tell us about your Tolkien origin story, if you will. Before we got on, everyone's hearing how many books he sold. If they didn't know him, now they're very fascinated. So, how did you discover his work and Middle Earth and all of that that captured your heart?
It was in my 20s that I first encountered. I was aware of his works when I was a teenager, but I was not an avid reader as a teenager. And the fantasy novels that I did read, which is its own whole story, that relates to Tolkien. Uh, they were somewhat of the antithesis of the Lord of the Rings lore and mythology. And so when I discovered the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit in my 20s, it was like a whole world opened up to me.
Wow. And that is exactly what he wanted for all of us is to have a whole world open up.
Yeah.
And that is so neat that you felt that new experience and a new side of literature that you didn't know, even though you were an avid reader. And that was
Mhm.
kind of my experience too. Do you feel like as a type 4 that it also spoke to you because the way he cares about describing beauty and the depths he goes to?
It does, and I'll say that it works on both sides of my nature of when I am in the better God-seeking side of my nature,
Mhm.
that it does feel like there's a beauty that opens up. But I recognize that when I close myself off and I become very egocentric, that that the side of literature is just emblematic that I would gravitate to of like, well, I want a story and I want high fantasy, but I'm okay with the really dark, brooding anti-heroes, which is where I was, I would say, in kind of teenage years. Uh,
Mhm.
there's a there's a fantasy writer by the name of Michael Moorcock
Okay.
who really did not like Tolkien's work, and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis really did not like Moorcock's work. And
Wow.
Moorcock wrote a series of novels around this character, Elric of Melniboné. And
Mm.
Elric is a albino king who carries with him a magical sword called Stormbringer. That whenever he would slay someone, it would take their strength and their power and give it to him. And he needed it to survive. And so Moorcock eventually wrote an article. He wrote an essay called The Epic Pooh, based off of Winnie the Pooh, as to why he did not like Tolkien and Lewis because it was just too happy for him. Because he had written this very dark. And I think it's so emblematic
Oh.
of the difference and the distinction of what Tolkien wanted to give to the world of this high art that had this depth of meaning about the search for meaning in the world. Whereas Moorcock and so many other modern fantasy writers, they just go to the worst parts of our nature and just traffic across it. And
Mm.
Tolkien just refused to do that.
Oh, that's a really good point. And he did expose the worst of our nature in his works, but he did not leave us hopeless. And I
Yeah.
think that for some writers, they want you to leave their works with a sense of despair and then now moving into some existentialism and something else. And
Mhm.
he decided instead to end us with hope. And I love how you named that and how you also named, of course, like the counterphobic sixes and some of the fives are like researching this other person now. But I love how you also named that in your darker moments. Tolkien's writings also helped you, which is really, I think, what a lot of our listeners experience that when they have opened themselves to this author, they've realized he's not just writing about the happy, joyful moments,
Mhm.
he's exposing how sin will keep us locked up too. And I just feel like he does that better than most people, don't you?
I really do, and it's because he took such care to create to build the world. I mean, obviously, he, in terms of a writer, is known as the one of the greatest world builders that literature has ever seen throughout all of human history.
Yeah.
And so, in order to build that detailed of a world and that
Oh.
vast of a world, you can't gloss over the evil that men do.
Mm.
And so, at the heart of the Middle Earth story is that this attempt to overcome the evil of how can the good, which is ultimately feels very simple, how
Mhm.
can it overcome the evil that seems to be so systemic?
And he takes a long time to help us to get there. And there are themes about how. And I'm going to pivot a little bit just to
Mhm.
ask you in your life as a father, a husband, and a grandfather. Now, I know you told us on the last episode how fun that is. What is one of the things you feel like you're learning from Hobbits and from Tolkien about how we get through these grand adventures from the perspective of when we hit those dark nights of the soul?
Yeah, I think that, one of the more off-quoted passages is the whole idea that if we would treasure, food and drink more than gold
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
treasure, the world would be a merrier place. And
Yeah.
there, and so one of the things that I do find myself feeling at home with Tolkien is in his letters to his son Christopher, he speaks at one point about he himself just felt like he was a hobbit. He feels very much at home with the hobbits.
Yeah.
And as now really as a grandfather, that I have this full-time job, it's very demanding hours
Mm.
upon me, but
Yeah.
all I want to do is just get to the party in the Shire with my grandchildren. And I
Yes.
just I just feel that there's such wisdom
Mm.
in the simplicity of the hobbits' lives. Not that they pushed away from work or they pushed away from accomplishment, but they
Mm.
just knew that the grandest of virtues in their lives was how can I just simply be with the people I love?
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so it helped reading the Lord of the Rings, interacting with that material just helps to hit the reset button for me very often of
Mhm.
what is it that I really desire, and what is it that brings fulfillment in my life. And so that really does bring up the faces of my wife, my sons, my
Mhm.
daughters-in-law, and my grandchildren.
Oh my goodness. And that is what everyone in that story is really longing for when we see one of the protagonists, of course, Frodo, but also just other leads. You see Sam, you see Aragorn. They're longing for these good things. Some of them are going to get them, some of them aren't as much,
Right.
but everyone's longing for that. And I think you just really named it that when we think of Tolkien's concept of eucatastrophe, joy at the turning of the dawn, that it isn't this grand new vision or idea or ideal self on social media hitting 100,000. It's family. It's just going home and like
Yeah.
taking off your shoes and being real, right?
Right. And even the main dwarf character, Gimli, I mean, he desperately doesn't want to pull back. He doesn't want anybody to know that he needs them, but he
Mhm.
desperately needs them. And then even as you watch the dwarf characters in The Hobbit and throughout all of the Middle Earth stories, that there's such a community to who they are, and ultimately all of the people groups throughout all of the Lord of the Rings, there is such a sense of community for each one of them. Though at
Mhm.
times they don't like each other, and you
Yeah.
have to, and so the story has to create tension in order for it to be a story. But within each of these groups, and then you have the Fellowship of the Ring, which is this muckrake group of guys who are going to
Mhm.
go on this journey together that don't fit together, but it's the found family
Oh
that
my gosh.
that then brings such joy and meaning and ultimately sacrifice to accomplish the one great deed that must be done.
Yes, I am so glad you named community because so many of us are isolated post COVID and forgetting that. And community is a lot of trouble. I was just actually writing to somebody within one of my parenting frameworks, and I was just this morning like, and I'll see you soon. Like, we're going to be part of each other's lives. So even though I have to address something in the, parenting world with somebody who works with one of my kids, it's like, we're still here together in this space world. And, like this is it. Welcome to life. Like I'm hoping to work with you. I'm hoping you'll work with all of us parents in this and that way. And I think that's what you're saying. Like we have to put up with each other's junk.
Oh yeah.
And that's what you see. I'm so glad you brought that up. And it makes me think of Gollum, one of the least liked characters, right? But at the same time, he may even be a representative. I don't know what you think, but do you think he's a representative of self, a part of us that we don't want to see the shadow side? Do you think he's a representative of almost like how extended family is? I don't, I've never thought
Yeah.
about that.
No, I love the phrase that you use of shadow self because
Yeah.
I think that's a great description of Gollum and Smeagol of
Oh,
this
yeah.
this bifurcated little creature that one side desperately wants to be connected with the found family, but the other is torn because of his desire for the my precious, for the power. that comes along with the isolated life where he can
Mm.
simply have what he wants or he can rule over others for what he wants.
Mhm.
And there is a great representation there of the struggle of the inner man, of which is gonna win. It reminds me of another one of my favorite novels, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr.
Mm,
Hyde,
it's a good one.
where all of the movies have done such great injustice to that story. I would encourage your listeners. It's a really short story, probably less than 100 pages in length,
Mhm.
but so worth it of showing that bifurcation of is the strong evil, kind of inner monologue going to overcome the more gentle, caring, community building persona.
Wow, it's been a long time since I've read that, and I'm going to go back as well because I do think you're saying Gollum and this as well. These are good examples for us to look at when we're having those moments of which is every day, which
Yeah.
way am I going to go? Am I going to go
Mhm.
the healthy way with community, even though it's tough? Or am I going to go back to self soothe in a way that's going to leave me, as Ian Cron said when he was on the podcast, isolated, which is the number one leading to addiction?
Yeah.
So I think that's really important that we keep that in mind, all of us. And that's why these works can be sobering. And he said about this story versus The Hobbit, this is no fairy tale in those letters you're referring to.
Right.
So I love that you brought that up. And also, we think of a different character, Sam, who is a companion to Frodo, who is carrying this big task. What do you make of that in terms of friendship? Have you thought about that in terms of any of your friendships or relationships? Just it's a solid friendship that we can look to.
Yeah, it really is, and I I do think about that friendship, and certainly as I was, just kind of rumbling over everything in my mind, knowing that we were going to have this conversation, I
Yeah.
think about a couple of different friendships that I have.
Mhm.
My best friend, the other guys that are in very close proximity to me relationally, of how there are times we have to take turns being Sam to Frodo. And sometimes you're Frodo that needs to be
Yeah, you
carried because
do.
you've got a great weight, and sometimes you need to be Sam, who says, "I can't do it for you, but I can be the one who holds you up." And it is this really wonderful model that none of us need to think that we have to be Sam all the time, that we're the
Mhm.
ones who have to,
Yeah.
always be the sidekick, as it were. But ultimately, Sam really is the hero of the whole story.
Yeah.
But I do think about that of how we trade off those roles of being the protector and the one who carries those that are close to us.
Oh, that is so beautiful. I love how you said that. My best friend and I, we spend a lot of time leaving each other these long audio messages, and we've been dear friends for, our entire marriages, which we're now both married 24 years, 1 month apart. And so it's been neat to do something similar. And just the other day, it was so funny. I just laughed while I was on my walk listening to her message because she goes, I've got this. I'll come back to you with more tips later. It's just like she was in her full Sam. She's like, I've
Yeah,
got this. I will be back. And I was laughing, like, oh, good for you.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but I know I'm going to do that for her next week. And it was just like such a beautiful thing. You reminded us that we're not always in one of these roles. But like we said, when we're in those dark night of the soul spaces, we may resonate more with Frodo, this protagonist who's feeling like, no, you don't get it, Sam. I have to do it all. And I'm
Yeah.
in my victim state. And yet there's something beautiful about him being willing to at least say, I will carry my cross. But I think we're realizing as we talk and as we reflect together that we can't really do it alone. We do need others on the journey, right?
Mhm.
He needed not only Sam, but even Gollum, which was so embarrassing, right?
Right. And there is this part of the story where this fellowship, this company of newfound friends, and comrades, and at times at odds with each other, that they're constantly searching for one another. It's not just the heroic battle at Helm's Deep. It's not just, when they're fighting off the orcs or the goblins. There's always a search for one another when the party gets separated. It's how do we find one another again? And that is such a great, moment. There are all of those great moments in the story where Sam has to come and find Frodo again, where Aragorn and Legolas, They're trying to find, you know, Frodo once again so that they can help with this great journey. And there are times where relationally we get lost from one another. It's not just that we're physically away from each other, it's relationally. We get
Mm.
lost from one another. And so, how do we find our way back? You know, how do we be the friend who doesn't give up on the relationship?
Oh my goodness. I love that. It really transitions us well into marriage conversation too, because I was just talking to some clients about that today. I was just saying some of us have to be willing to be the finder, the seeker, the person who looks, because the other person has more trauma or is wrapped up in it more often. And it can feel exhausting, but somebody has to do it. And a couple yesterday was saying, which one of us is it going to be, the chicken or the egg? We don't know who has to do the seeking. And it's basically like whoever has the strength, because like you said, we could be the Frodo or the Sam. But I think that some of us will have that character wired in a bit more to be that
Mhm.
helper, to be that seeker. And others of us will have a different journey, which we're trying not to judge about the other one, but to say, hey, maybe if they are more of a Frodo-ish person, they will need a little bit more rescuing at times, but they may have a deeper task. So have you seen it in your marriage or your family in any way where you've had to do some of that, or even kind of notice this is a Tolkien moment when I see this seeking and finding?
Oh, absolutely. Angie and I have been married for, at the time that we're recording this, 31 years. And
Oh,
our sons are 29 and 27. And then one of our sons has our two grandchildren, he and his wife. And so, yeah, over the course of 31 years, there have been times when either Angie or I have made decisions to be checked out and more distant than we ought to. Now, we've been blessed that we've never reached a breaking point.
yes,
We've had tense moments, but not to the point that we're at the point of no return.
right.
And then also with our sons, there have been moments of relational distance, and that's the normative pace of life when they're turning from boys to men.
Right.
That they're striking out on their own. They're making worldview choices that we wouldn't make, that we don't want them to make. And so that's where, again, Tolkien can be so helpful because there's all of these layers to relationship of how you seek the other person. There is the simplicity of the hobbits that they just want to be
True.
happy in the Shire. And so
Yeah.
there's a certain naivete
Yeah.
that it's easy to come back together. You know, you have the spat, but you see each other again in the kitchen or at the Friday night party
Mhm.
and everything is made clean, or you have this intense longing that the men of Rohan or even the elvish kingdom, where it is this great kind of abiding kind of romanticism where there's real strife that has to be worked through. But then one little detail that I think gets lost that a lot of us feel though is the longing of the Ents, the ENTS, which are the trees, the living trees. And Treebeard is the spokesperson for the Ents. And within the history of Middle Earth, when we see them in the story, they're all male characters, and they get asked about their wives, and there are Ent wives that disappeared eons ago, and the Ents have always been on the search to find their Ent wives,
Mm.
and it is this thing that just kind of hangs when you finally see that detail.
Oh my.
That here are these men, we'll just say men for the
Yeah.
moment, they're
Right. Yeah.
trees, but
Right.
these male characters that have this eternal affection for what has been lost. And so, but they signal very clearly that they will never give up on the search for their Entwives who went off on a great journey and a great adventure, but that they're never going to give up on finding them.
Oh,
And I want to have that kind of longing in my heart for my wife.
oh my goodness, that's beautiful. And I think it's really speaking to me and everybody listening, just that it's one of those depictions that Tolkien himself, in one of his letters to his son, said, and I think of this letter all the time in my field, of course. He says, men are more romantic generally and women are more practical. And I have found that to be so true for a while, that while women are also usually part of the courting, obviously, in the wooing, afterwards, often it's the men who are just the ones saying, like, hey, where's our fun? Where's our adventure? Where's our romance? And that can go in both directions, right? They may have
Mhm.
been so busy as ents doing that they forgot their wives and made their wives mad. But at the same token, I love the romantic spirit that he wrote, obviously about what he truly felt, that there's this deep romantic part of men. And I thank him for that now, looking at today, because men are bewildered in culture and we're learning how to keep masculinity healthy versus erasing it. And so thank you for just bringing that up as just the way you want to love your wife. That's, yes, that's masculine. And that's from his work.
It's a there are all of these beautiful depictions of the largest ethereal kind of ideas that we live through down to the most basic, just daily enjoyments of what the next 24 hours brings, of the meal, of the song, of the dinner table, of the way that we rib one another and joke with one another. It just spans the whole gamut of life's experience.
It does. And I've been through this conversation and prior, I did one Tolkien episode a while back, but really thinking about different people who, what personality types tend to be certain ones. And I think of those 3 6s and 9s on the ground, like the hobbits resourcing, and then sometimes the 2s, 5s, and 8s in the middle, something like those, dwarves kind of seeking and looking and being a bit scared to be vulnerable, but they're heading around that mountain, just saying, let's find each other. Maybe the ents are there too. But then at that top of the mountain, the 1s, 4s, and 7s, the idealists among us, I think of them as kind of these elves or people like Frodo's who are just looking for what is ethereal and it's hard to find it. And, holding out for, sometimes in an unhealthy way, unforgiveness because we expected perfection. So it's funny to hear you say that. And I'm just thinking, yeah, some of these people were satisfied with just a quick makeup, like, oh, yeah, we had a fight as a couple, we're good. And then there's others who are like, I'm holding that forever.
Yes.
Some of those feuds with the elves and the dwarves went forever.
Yeah, they really did. And the inner and you see that even in the fellowship, the interplay that has to happen
Yeah.
between
Mm.
Aragorn, the man, and Legolas,
Oh, yeah, the man.
the elf, and Gimli, the dwarf. It's this point of constant tension
Mm.
that is a teaching element to us as to how are we going to live our lives with those that are the different personalities that do see life very differently, that are going to value that all of these things, we all value them at some level:
Yeah.
family,
Right.
accomplishment, reputation.
Yeah.
So the relationships, the reputation, and the rewards. I'll put it, in the three R's,
I like
and
that.
we all value those three elements. But it's how do we live at peace with that person who has a personality type or who has a disposition to elevate something beyond where we would elevate it? How do we learn to see life from their perspective? And that's I pulled this off my shelf. There is this book called The Proverbs of Middle Earth
Oh
by
my
David Rowe.
gosh. That.
I don't know David. I've come to meet him just via social media.
Yeah.
But he wrote this book, The Proverbs of Middle Earth, based on all of the people types that are
Wow.
in Tolkien's legends, and then he deals with it from their proverbs, all of the wise sayings that they had amongst their people. It's a fascinating book that that I don't think David had it as necessarily his purpose to try to help us to understand ourselves any more than Tolkien's trying to do that.
Yeah.
But those people types, those character types,
Yeah.
does reveal something about how we need, or how we could, if we want to, if we'll lean into it, how we can relate to one another better.
Thank you. I'm going to look into that as a recommendation. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate how you're naming that, although that might not have been and likely wasn't the main purpose of the book, from what we can see from Tolkien sharing, it's much more relevant to those of us who like personality work, who are doing that self work, to say, how can I learn from others? Because, right, our self work, we don't want it to be just about us. We want it to be learning about me and why I don't like this person, or this person's tough for me, but learning about them and what they have to offer. That's really where the spirit of Christian love comes in, right?
Yeah.
That we have to say, I know you have value. And that's hard to say when you're mad. It's hard to say, you know what, I have issues, so do you, and there but for the grace go both of us. It's so much
Mhm.
easier to say, I'm mad, you're bad, I'm outgrouping you and your people. And I really appreciate how you just named that within Tolkien's work, there's so many pieces of value within each group, even the one we're most likely to forget and say, Gollum has no value. Anyone who's putting up with somebody that's unhealthy and toxic should, that person, why is God letting them live? I think we can get down to some of these root questions and say each person has value and there's a hope for each of us to be used, right?
Oh, absolutely. And in each one of these enter into our lives for those kind of purposes of, we're
Mhm.
building perseverance, we're building patience with one another, we're asking other people to build patience in their lives with our presence. And it is fascinating. We all want to be Frodo or Aragorn, and more oftentimes we are Pippin or we are Gollum.
That's a
And,
really humbling point.
I mean, we read these stories and we cast ourselves, in the best light possible. But it is,
Suffering servant.
yeah, right, right. Uh, but we do need to see ourselves as the one who's been tainted,
Mhm.
the one who has been scarred by the world, the one who has been, whether we've been abused by the world or we have abused the world and we have these self-inflicted wounds. It is this opportunity of soul searching and of better understanding our personalities in the grand narrative and scope of Christ has come to deliver us from what is destroying us, and that he has come to deliver us from the shadow of death into the bright light of his kingdom. And Tolkien, I think, was relatively clear that he was not trying to write a Christocentric storyline,
Right.
whereas his, close friend C.S. Lewis was with
Right.
Chronicles of Narnia.
Right.
Nevertheless, all of his Christian faith that Tolkien has shines through of the arcs of redemption, of the possibilities of total transformation, and of the building of community around the redemptive work that can be done.
That is so well said. And I couldn't agree more that when I need spiritual encouragement and faith, on another episode for people to go back to, you gave us some great tips about how you and Angie study God's word and about the open Bible and all these, just the page, just being, instead of our virtual Bible studies, to be on the page. But here I'm reminded that this is why I go back to this series again and again, because I find Christ in the pages and different characters at different moments. And it honestly gives me courage to go forward when I am in a dark place. So
Mm.
thank you for this time today. And I would love to ask you if you wouldn't mind sharing a few of your favorite Tolkien resources, either from Thomas Nelson or otherwise, just so people can hear where might they start.
Yeah, and so this book that I've shared by David Rowe, which is a fairly new book, The Proverbs of Middle Earth, I have said to a few friends, I wish I had that book years ago so that then when I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, I would better understand it. And so, but I encourage people, read The Hobbit first. That's what Tolkien wrote first. And then read The Lord of the Rings. But this book by Rowe is so fascinating. The other book that we've kind of almost mentioned a couple times is The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Mhm.
And as somebody who is a writer, I am both fascinated and a little infuriated that a man could write just a casual letter to his son, and it's better writing than I feel like I've ever done in my entire life. But the book, the Letters of Tolkien, are all of his correspondence that's in chronological order. And so you get to actually watch the development of The Hobbit as he goes back and forth with his friends and with his son and
Publishers.
with his publishers, along with The Lord of the Rings, and then all of his interactions, especially that are so poignant with his son that is deployed in the military during World War II. And so it's just so fascinating. And so those are my core. The other resource from Tolkien that is not in The Lord of the Rings, but that I just love is when he was a young professor, he did his own translation of Beowulf, which Beowulf is my favorite story of all time. I
Wow.
absolutely just am fascinated by it because of its ancient nature. But he did his own translation of Beowulf, and so even if you've never read Beowulf, read Tolkien's version of it, and
Mm.
you just get a sense and a flair for who he is. And then the biography about Tolkien and Lewis and a few of their friends called The Inklings.
Mhm.
It's a great story about those four men who were all professors together and best friends and walked with each other on their own journeys of faith.
Those are rich. And now I am really thankful that you shared that about Beowulf as well, because I remember learning about it in college, looking a few times to see if I could be courageous enough to dip in. I think I will. But you make me want to go back to the letters even more because those were some of my most joyful reading. And the fascination, like you said, of his exquisite writing. I can't tell you how many times I stopped reading and shared a letter with my husband who likes Tolkien almost as much as me, but C.S. Lewis is his favorite. We named our son Jack Lewis after C.S. Lewis.
Oh, oh wow.
We like him a lot too, but I just really agree heartily here, guys. Make sure you take Phil's advice for that book about the letters if you haven't dipped in. So thank you so much. I can't wait to get started on the first book you mentioned that you showed us earlier too. So this has been such a rich, joyful conversation. Thank you for encouraging us here today.
So glad to do it. Thanks for inviting me back on the pod, and hope everybody enjoys their day, walking with the Lord and enjoying the good graces that we get through writers like Tolkien.
Yes, right there with you. Thank you. Aw. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm so grateful for these referrals. Like I said, I'm already reading the Proverbs of Middle Earth and learning the differential histories and discussions about the elves versus the wizards versus the dwarves. And delving in a little deeper is a much welcome vacation moment for me. So, wherever you are in the world, I hope you are allowing for some good times. On Wednesday's episode, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about couples and what you can do as you process getting freedom from the tough cycles you're in. Until then, I hope you can just allow for some rest, some fiction, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.